Regret rarely shows up all at once. It creeps in quietly, years later. You look back at your life and wonder where the time went, why the things you meant to do never happened, why the conversations that mattered got cut short, why the moments that could have meant something slipped through your hands. And a lot of that regret traces back to one simple habit: distraction. Because most of the time when people talk about distraction, they blame the outside world, the phone, the apps, the noise, the endless stream of notifications. But here's the uncomfortable truth. About 90% of the time, distraction doesn't come from what's happening around you. It comes from what's happening inside you. Think about a simple moment. You're sitting with a friend. Nothing dramatic happening, just the two of you, maybe a pause in the conversation, a little silence settling into the space. And then, almost automatically, you reach for your phone. Not because something urgent happened, not because you needed information, but because silence feels uncomfortable. Boredom creeps in, and the instinct is immediate. Escape it. That's the real driver behind most human behavior. We are constantly trying to move away from discomfort, not toward purpose, not toward meaning, away from discomfort. It's easy to do things you enjoy. Nobody struggles to start a movie they want to watch. Nobody has trouble opening an app that delivers instant entertainment. The real challenge is something else entirely. How do you do the things you don't feel like doing? The work that's tedious, the effort that feels heavy, the task that doesn't reward you immediately. That's where everything breaks down, and that's where discipline starts. There's a technique, supported by thousands of studies, that helps people handle exactly that problem, learning how to stay with the uncomfortable task instead of escaping it. Because if you never master that skill, everything else becomes harder, sometimes impossible. Now, there's an important distinction to make here. ADHD is real. For the people who truly struggle with it, the condition can be deeply debilitating. It affects focus, impulse control, and the ability to organize behavior in ways that make daily life extremely difficult. That reality shouldn't be dismissed. But there's another concern that's harder to ignore. About 10% of children in the United States are diagnosed with ADHD. In parts of Europe, the number is closer to 1%. That gap raises questions, because when numbers differ that drastically, it suggests something else may be happening. A culture that's becoming more comfortable with quick medical explanations and quick pharmaceutical solutions. There's a growing tendency to train an entire generation to believe that the answer to difficulty comes in a pill bottle. But medication is not neutral. These drugs carry real consequences. And even the long-standing idea that ADHD or many other conditions are simply the result of a chemical imbalance in the brain, that explanation has been increasingly questioned. In fact, many psychiatrists today will admit that the chemical imbalance theory was always far more complicated than it was presented to the public, which is why an important principle often gets overlooked: skills before pills. Before reaching for medication, people need tools, strategies, the ability to sit with discomfort and work through it. Because if you never master that skill, something dangerous can happen. The condition stops being something you manage and starts becoming part of who you believe you are. And in some corners of the ADHD community, that shift has already taken hold. The diagnosis becomes an identity, something permanent, something defining. But when a struggle becomes an identity, it stops being something you work to improve. It becomes something you protect. And that might be one of the most dangerous distractions of all. Regret is a heavy thing to carry. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. Not one big mistake that ruins everything. I'm talking about the quiet kind. The kind that creeps in slowly when you look back on your life and realize you knew exactly what you should have done, but you didn't do it. That's the kind that hurts. And the reason to talk about distraction at all is simple. Regret sucks. Living with it is awful. The work I do, honestly, it's mostly for myself. I write to solve my own problems. Because the one thing I never want is to look back on my life and think I wasted it. Not for a day, not for a month, not for a year, and certainly not for a lifetime. And the strange thing is, most of us already know what to do. We know we should exercise. We know we should eat better. We know we should spend real time with our families. We know we should do the hard work that moves our careers forward. None of that information is hidden. If you don't know what to do, you can literally Google it. The advice is everywhere. Books, podcasts, articles, experts. So the real problem isn't a lack of knowledge. The problem is that we keep getting in our own way. That's where the idea of becoming indistractable comes in. Learning how to stop sabotaging your own intentions. Learning how to live the kind of life you already know you want. Because if you look closely, your ability to control your attention touches every part of your life. Want to learn a new skill? You need attention. Want to build strong relationships? You need attention. Want to succeed in business? Stay physically fit? Follow through on goals? All of it depends on the same ability. Doing what you said you were going to do. That's why this might be one of the most important skills of this century. If you never learn it, everything else becomes harder, sometimes impossible. But if you do, if you can become indistractable, it almost feels like a superpower. That word, indistractable, was actually created to sound a little like indestructible, because that's what it represents, a kind of mental strength that helps you follow through on the life you want. And the goal isn't to tell people what they should do. That's not the point. If someone wants to spend their free time playing video games all day, that's their choice. What matters is something much simpler. Are you doing the things you say you want to do with your time and attention? That's the real question. Because here's the strange paradox. We live in a world overflowing with information about how to live well. Health advice, productivity strategies, success frameworks, you name it. You can listen to hours of experts explaining exactly what habits lead to better health. Don't eat sugar, exercise more, sleep better, build routines. And yet, people hear all of that and still struggle to follow through. The intention is there. The behavior never shows up. So what's standing in the way? To answer that, you first have to understand what distraction actually is. Most people think the opposite of distraction is focus, but that's not true. The word distraction comes from a Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. And if something pulls you away, the opposite must be something that pulls you toward something. That word is traction. Traction and distraction. Both end with the same 6 letters, action, which reveals something important. Distraction isn't something that just happens to you. It's an action, something you do. Traction is any action that pulls you toward what you plan to do, toward your goals, your values, the person you want to become. Distraction is the opposite, any action that pulls you away from those intentions. And here's the key insight. Any activity done with intention, planned ahead of time, is traction. Even things people love to blame. Social media, video games, entertainment. If you plan to do it, if you chose it consciously, it's not a problem. There's an old line from Dorothy Parker. The time you plan to waste is not wasted time. The real danger hides somewhere else, because some distractions wear a disguise. In fact, the worst distractions are the ones that look productive. Picture this moment. You sit down at your desk. You know the big task you need to tackle, the project that actually matters. You say to yourself, all right, this time I'm focused. Nothing's going to interrupt me. And then your brain whispers something small. Let me just check my email first. Or I'll quickly respond to that Slack message. Or maybe you open your to-do list and start knocking off the easy tasks just to get into the rhythm. It feels productive, but it's a trap. Because if it's not the thing you plan to do with your time, it's still distraction, even if it's work-related. In fact, those are often the most dangerous distractions of all, the ones that trick you into believing you're not distracted. So now we can see the 2 forces at play. Traction, moving toward what matters. Distraction, moving away from it. But there's another piece of the puzzle. Triggers. Triggers are the things that push us into action. There are 2 kinds. External triggers come from the outside world. Notifications, buzzing phones, computer alerts, the things we usually blame. But research shows something surprising. External triggers only account for about 10% of our distractions. 10%. So what causes the other 90? Internal triggers. These come from inside us. Uncomfortable emotions, boredom, stress, loneliness, anxiety, uncertainty. And when those feelings show up, we instinctively try to escape them. That's the real driver of distraction. Not technology, emotion. In fact, you could argue that nearly every self-control problem comes down to emotional regulation. Time management, pain management. Weight management, pain management. Money management, pain management. At the root of almost all human behavior is the same instinct: escape discomfort. And that's why people struggle to do the things they know they should do, because those tasks often come bundled with discomfort. So the first step to becoming indistractable is learning how to deal with those internal triggers. Then comes the next step, making time for traction, planning the actions that move your life forward. The third step is learning how to control external triggers, the devices, alerts, and interruptions around you. And the final step is building pacts with yourself, commitments that prevent distraction before it starts. 4 simple steps. It sounds straightforward, but it took years to refine that idea. 5 years of research, hundreds of studies, dozens of behavioral experiments, pages and pages of citations. And ironically, the reason it took that long was the same problem everyone else struggles with: distraction. But once those ideas finally came together, once the model became clear, something changed. Because when you understand how distraction really works, you finally have a chance to stop living the kind of life that fills people with regret. Sometimes it feels like your own brain is working against you. You know sugar isn't good for you, yet your mind keeps pulling you toward it. You know scrolling on TikTok for an hour isn't what you plan to do, yet somehow you're still there, thumb moving, video after video. And that creates this strange feeling, like your wiring is broken, like your instincts are betraying you. But that tension actually reveals something important about behavior change, because the problem isn't just willpower, it's deeper than that. To really understand it, you have to look at the whole system. The first step is learning to recognize what's happening inside you, the internal triggers that push your behavior in certain directions. What are you actually feeling at that moment? Take something like food. Imagine you're trying to avoid eating that chocolate bar. On the surface, it looks like a hunger problem, but very often it isn't hunger at all. Sometimes it's loneliness. Sometimes it's boring. Sometimes it's guilt. There are people who struggle with overeating who will tell you the same story. At one point, I was clinically obese, and I can tell you honestly, I wasn't overeating because I was starving. I ate too much because I was lonely. I ate too much because I was bored. I ate too much because I felt guilty about what I had already eaten. It becomes a loop. The behavior isn't really about food. It's about trying to escape a feeling. And that's the key insight. Very few people who struggle with obesity are simply hungry all the time. That's not what's driving the behavior. They're eating their emotions. The same pattern shows up everywhere else in life. Technology, social media, endless scrolling. It's tempting to blame the tools, to say the problem is TikTok or Instagram, or whatever platform happens to be popular right now. But that explanation is too simple. Before social media, people blamed television. Before television, they blamed radio. Before radio, it was comic books. Every generation has its moral panic, something people say is melting our brains. But those things are usually just tools. The real driver sits somewhere deeper. We're trying to escape internal discomfort, boredom, loneliness, stress, anxiety. That's why the idea that time management is really pain management makes so much sense. In many cases, all human behavior is driven by a single instinct, the desire to escape discomfort. And once you see that clearly, a lot of things start making sense. The endless scrolling, procrastination, the extra snack you didn't plan to eat. They're not random mistakes. They're attempts to avoid a feeling. But here's the important part. You can't deal with those behaviors until you understand what feeling you're trying to escape in the first place. If you can't sit at a table with a friend without checking your phone every 3 minutes, the phone isn't the real problem. The problem is the discomfort underneath that moment. Maybe it's silence. Maybe it's boredom. Maybe it's something going on in your life that you don't want to sit with. Until you learn to recognize that sensation and tolerate it, you'll keep reaching for the same distractions, which is why mastering those internal triggers is the first step. Not the only step, but the first and maybe the most important. Most people can see the behavior. That part isn't hard. They notice the pattern, the extra food they didn't need, the endless scrolling, the late-night habits that leave them feeling worse the next day, the things they keep doing, even when they know those things are pulling them away from the life they actually want. The behavior is obvious. What's much harder is answering the deeper question: why? Why do we keep doing the thing we know we shouldn't? Because finding that root cause, that's where things get tricky. Most people don't know what they don't know. The surface problem is visible, but the real driver sits somewhere underneath it. And when people hear that, they often assume the answer must be complicated. Years of therapy, deep psychological excavation, endless analysis. But surprisingly, it doesn't always have to be that complex. Sometimes the starting point is incredibly simple. Picture this. On the corner of a desk, there's a small post-it note. Nothing fancy, just a little square of paper and the pen nearby. And every time distraction shows up, or even when the urge to get distracted appears, the only task is to pause and write something down. One question: what was I feeling right before this? That's it. No long journal entries, no complicated self-analysis. Just capture the moment. Because when you're working on something meaningful, something that actually matters, you'll notice something interesting. The mind starts looking for exits. You sit down to write, and suddenly you feel the urge to Google something, or check email just for a second, or open a browser tab to research something that might help. It all feels productive. But those little moves are often just polished versions of distraction. They pull you away from the core task you said you were going to do. And if you pause for just a moment, before you follow that urge, you can ask the real question: what was I feeling right before this? Maybe it was boredom, maybe anxiety, maybe uncertainty. Just writing that down is powerful, because the moment you name the feeling, you begin to see it clearly. And once you see it clearly, you can start doing something important. You can reframe the trigger. Let's say you're working on something important. You feel that tension building, the urge to escape, to check something else, to step away. Instead of reacting automatically, you pause. You ask yourself, what's going on here? Maybe the answer is stress. And then another question follows. Why am I stressed? Because this matters. Because you want to get it right. Because you care about the outcome. Suddenly, the emotion looks different. Instead of something happening to you, it becomes something happening for you. A signal. Most people interpret discomfort as danger. When anxiety or restlessness appears, they assume it's something they need to escape immediately. So they reach for distraction. But that interpretation isn't the only option. You can treat the feeling as information, a message. And this is where the real difference between people begins to show. High performers experience the same internal triggers everyone else does. They feel anxiety. They feel loneliness. They feel uncertainty. They're not immune to those emotions. The difference is how they respond. When they feel those uncomfortable signals, they don't immediately run from them. They use them. They treat those emotions like rocket fuel, something that pushes them toward action, toward traction, toward the work that matters. Meanwhile, distractible people do the opposite. The moment discomfort appears, they try to escape it. Scroll something, check something, eat something, watch something. Anything that removes the feeling. Same emotions, completely different response. And that small shift, how you interpret the discomfort you feel, might be the line that separates distraction from progress. Procrastination rarely looks like fear. It usually shows up dressed as something harmless. A quick email, a little research, checking something important for just a minute. But underneath those small actions, there's often a moment you can catch, if you pause long enough. A moment where you ask yourself a simple question. What discomfort am I trying to escape right now? That question alone can change everything. Imagine you're working on a book. You reach a chapter that suddenly feels heavy. Your brain heats up just thinking about it. Maybe you're not sure you've researched it well enough. Maybe you don't feel competent writing about it yet. So the mind does what it always does. It looks for an exit. You open another tab, check something else, delay the task just a little longer. But if you stop and ask that question, what am I avoiding right now? The answer becomes clear. It's not laziness, it's discomfort. Maybe uncertainty, maybe self-doubt, maybe the fear of getting it wrong. That moment of awareness is the first step. Because if you don't learn to recognize those internal triggers, they end up controlling you. You either master them or they become your master. But awareness alone isn't enough. Once you understand the feeling, the next step is to make time for traction, to deliberately return to the thing you said you were going to do. And there's a surprisingly powerful technique that helps with this. It sounds almost strange at first. You schedule time to worry. Actually, put it on the calendar. Here's why that matters. When an uncomfortable thought shows up, doubt, anxiety, uncertainty, a distractible person feels the urge to deal with it immediately. They stop what they're doing. They start thinking it through, searching for answers, trying to resolve the feeling right away. But that reaction usually pulls them further into distraction. Instead, the better approach is much simpler. When the discomfort shows up, you write it down. Just a quick note. Feeling anxious about this chapter. Not sure I researched it well enough. Then you go right back to the task. You don't solve the emotion in that moment. You postpone it. Later, at a specific time you've scheduled, you return to that note. That's when you process the worry. That's when you sit with the feeling and think it through. Because the mind relaxes when it knows the concern won't be ignored. It's just being handled later. So instead of letting discomfort derail your focus, you acknowledge it, capture it, schedule it, and then you return to the work that actually matters. So how do we actually handle that urge to just give up? There's a technique, something incredibly powerful for dealing with those internal triggers. It's a tool designed to stop the slide into distraction before it ever takes over. It's called the 10-minute rule. The rule is surprisingly simple. You can give in to any distraction you want. Seriously, any distraction. Maybe you want a cigarette. Maybe you want that piece of chocolate cake. Maybe you want to open social media. That's allowed. But not right now. You can give in 10 minutes. Not for 10 minutes. In 10 minutes. That small shift changes everything. Because instead of telling yourself no, you're telling yourself something much more powerful. I'm in control. A lot of people try strict abstinence. No sugar, no distractions, no checking anything. The problem is that this approach often backfires. When you tell yourself you absolutely cannot do something, the mind starts obsessing over it. You think about it more. You fight with yourself. I want it, but I shouldn't. I want it, but I shouldn't. That internal tug of war builds tension. And eventually, the pressure breaks. You give in. Interestingly, this pattern shows up in research on smoking. Many smokers say they smoke because it relaxes them, which sounds strange because nicotine is actually a stimulant. So why does it feel relaxing? Because when they finally smoke, the internal argument stops. They don't have to keep telling themselves no anymore. The conflict ends. And that relief feels like relaxation. The 10-minute rule interrupts that cycle. Instead of banning the behavior, you postpone it. You say, I can do that, just not yet. And suddenly the pressure drops. You've given yourself permission. You've also stayed in control. And here's the fascinating part. Most of the time, after those 10 minutes pass, the urge weakens. Sometimes it disappears completely. And even when it doesn't, you've still proven something important to yourself. You can delay gratification. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that's manageable. Over time, those small delays grow stronger. 10 minutes becomes 12.
12 becomes 15. You start building real impulse control. And that realization matters because a lot of distraction problems feel like addiction. People say things like, my brain is hijacked, or I'm powerless against this. But when you use tools like the 10-minute rule, you start seeing something different. You're not powerless. You're capable of pausing, capable of choosing. That's step one, learning to handle those internal triggers. But there's another piece that comes next. Later in the day, you return to the feelings you postponed. You actually schedule time to worry. It sounds strange, but it works. You literally block time on your calendar called worry time. That's when you take out the notes you wrote earlier, the doubts, the anxieties, the thoughts that almost derailed you. And then you examine them. What's interesting is what usually happens next. 9 out of 10 of those worries disappear. When you finally look at them calmly, you realize they weren't that important. They didn't actually require action. They just felt urgent at the moment. And the 1 out of 10 that truly matters, now you finally have the time and mental space to think about it properly. This process does two powerful things. First, it keeps those worries from hijacking your day. Second, it tells your brain something important. We're not ignoring the problem, we're just handling it later. That alone can calm the mind. The same principle even works with kids. Parents often worry about things like video games or online time, but one effective approach is simply scheduling that time. Put it on the calendar. If a child knows they can play Fortnite later in the day, they stop obsessing over when it will happen. They don't spend the entire afternoon thinking about it. It's already planned. And the same logic applies to distractions, worries, cravings, almost any urge. When you give them a place in your schedule, they stop trying to take over your attention every minute of the day. You're sitting there with the book open in front of you, chapter 12, the one that suddenly feels heavier than all the others. Your brain is restless. Thoughts keep popping up, little worries, doubts, things you feel like you should check or fix or research before you keep going. But you've already done the first part. You noticed the feeling, you wrote it down, you scheduled time later to think about it. Now comes the second step. Make time for traction. And that means finishing the time you committed to. Let's say you told yourself you'd work on the book for 30 minutes. Then your job isn't to feel inspired. Your job isn't to produce brilliant writing. Your job is simply to finish the time box. That's it. Even if you're just sitting there staring at the screen. There's an idea in Steven Pressfield's book, The War of Art, that captures this perfectly. He says, what separates amateurs from professionals is very simple. Professionals put their butt in the chair. They show up. They do the work. Not because they always feel motivated, but because that's the job. And something interesting usually happens when you follow that rule. At first, it feels incredibly boring. You sit there and your brain starts whispering, maybe I'm just not feeling it today. Maybe I should take a break. Maybe I should come back later. Those thoughts show up almost every time you start something difficult. But if you just stay there, hands on the keyboard, eyes on the page, something shifts. Maybe after 30 seconds, maybe after a minute, sometimes after 20 minutes. But eventually, the engine starts again. The words come back. The ideas begin moving. And even if they don't, if the whole 30 minutes passes and you still feel stuck, that's okay. Because the real goal was never perfect work. The goal was honoring the time you committed to. That's traction. Now comes the third step, hacking back the external triggers. This is where people usually start the conversation, but in reality, it's only part of the problem. External triggers are the obvious distractions, the pings, the dings, the rings, phones lighting up, notifications buzzing, messages popping up. Those things matter, but research shows they account for only about 10% of our distractions. Still, they're worth managing. So this step becomes a systematic process. You look at the usual suspects, your phone, your computer, the apps constantly demanding your attention.
But here's where it gets interesting. Often the real distractions aren't the devices themselves, it's what those devices are connected to. Sometimes the distraction is your boss. Sometimes it's your coworkers on Slack. Sometimes it's endless email chains. And sometimes it's the people you love most, your kids. Of course, they matter more than anything, but anyone who has tried to focus while raising children knows how easily attention gets pulled away. Then there are meetings. So many meetings. Meetings that could have been emails. Meetings that don't lead anywhere. Meetings that eat hours of your day. Especially now that video calls make it possible for someone to summon you instantly no matter where you are. Those become some of the biggest external distractions of all. So step 3 is about identifying those triggers and dealing with them deliberately. Not ignoring them, not pretending they don't exist, but designing your environment in a way that protects the time you've chosen to spend on what actually matters.
Picture the modern workplace. Rows of desks. No walls. No doors. Just an open space where anyone can walk up at any moment. Hey Jenny, got a minute? Can you take a look at this real quick? Sorry to bother you, but it happens everywhere. In tech companies, in hospitals, in research labs, in offices where people are constantly surrounded by others who can tap them on the shoulder and pull them out of whatever they were doing. And the strange thing is, most of these interruptions are well-intentioned. People aren't trying to sabotage your focus, but the result is the same. Your attention gets pulled away, again and again. So how do you protect your focus in an environment like that? One surprisingly simple method is visual signaling. Imagine a small piece of cardstock placed on your computer monitor, a bright sign that says something like, "I'm indistractable right now. Please come back later." It's simple, direct, clear. In an open office, that little sign can act like a temporary wall. People immediately understand what's happening. You're in a focused block of time. Some people try to achieve the same thing with headphones, but that doesn't always work. When someone sees headphones, they might assume you're listening to music or watching something. They don't realize you're actually working with intention. A clear signal removes the guesswork. But distractions don't only come from coworkers. Sometimes they come from the person who controls your workload. Your boss. This is where many people say, "I've tried everything. I've managed notifications, I've scheduled focus time, but my manager keeps interrupting me." So what do you do then? This is where the idea of managing your manager comes in. And it starts with something very simple, your time-boxed calendar. When you schedule your time intentionally, meetings, deep work, email, projects, you end up with something powerful, an artifact, something physical you can show someone else. So imagine sitting down with your boss for 15 minutes at the beginning of the week. You say, "Hey, could we spend a few minutes reviewing my schedule for the week?" Then you show them your calendar. You point to the blocks. This is the meeting we have here. This is the time I'm responding to emails. This is my focused work block for Project A. And then you show them another list, a second piece of paper. This is everything else you've asked me to do that I'm struggling to fit into the schedule. Now, something interesting happens because you've just avoided one of the worst pieces of productivity advice people love to repeat. Just say no. That might sound empowering, but it's terrible advice for most people. If someone pays your salary, telling them no isn't always a realistic strategy. Instead, you're doing something much smarter. You're inviting them to help you prioritize. You ask a simple question. Based on my schedule this week, which of these tasks should take priority? Now the responsibility shifts to the person who actually controls the priorities. And what usually happens next is almost immediate. Your boss scans the list and says something like, "You know what? That meeting actually isn't that important. But this project here, that one matters. Let's move that up." In that moment, you're doing something powerful called schedule syncing. Your calendar begins reflecting their priorities, not just the chaotic pile of requests. And surprisingly, most managers love this process because every manager quietly wonders the same thing. What are my people actually working on right now? They often hesitate to ask directly because they don't want to seem like they're micromanaging. But when you bring the schedule to them first, when you proactively show them your plan, you remove that tension. You're saying, this is how I'm using my time. This is when I need focused work. This is when I'll be indistractable. And when that alignment happens, protecting your attention stops looking like resistance. It starts looking like professionalism.
If you ask what a founder's real job is, it sounds almost too simple. Prioritize. That's it. Not marketing, not product, not fundraising. Prioritize. Because every founder lives inside the same constraint. Limited resources, limited time, limited attention, limited money, and far more ideas than any team could possibly execute. Every day, another idea appears. Another opportunity, another feature, another direction the company could go. And without a clear system for deciding what actually matters, something strange starts to happen. A month passes, then another, and suddenly the company isn't working on the most important things anymore. It's working on the first things, the projects that started earlier, the tasks someone already began, the ideas that gained momentum simply because nobody stopped them. Meanwhile, better opportunities show up later and get buried under the weight of everything that's already in motion. And stopping those projects can feel almost painful because by that point, people have invested time, energy, pride. Maybe a team has already spent 2 weeks building something. Maybe you were the one who announced the project in the first place. Now imagine standing in front of that team and saying, "We're canceling it." Even when you know it's the right call, it can feel uncomfortable. It feels wasteful. It feels like admitting you were wrong. But there's a powerful psychological force behind that hesitation. It's called commitment bias, sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy. Once we've invested time, effort, or money into something, we start valuing it more than we should. We keep going, not because it's the best decision moving forward, but because we've already invested so much in the past. But in business, that mindset can quietly destroy companies. There's an old lesson from business school that captures this perfectly. Every business dies for the same reason. One reason. They run out of cash. Cash is oxygen. Oxygen is life. And the number one cause of a business running out of cash? Doing the wrong thing for too long. That's the real danger. Not making mistakes. Every company makes mistakes. The danger is refusing to stop the mistake once you recognize it. Which is why the ability to cut your losses, to say, this felt right at the time, but now we're moving in a different direction, is one of the most important skills a leader can develop. Because leadership isn't about always being right. It's about adjusting fast enough to stay alive. And in the end, that brings us back to the same core idea: prioritization. The leaders who are good at prioritizing, who can clearly decide what matters and what doesn't, tend to become good CEOs. The ones who struggle with that skill usually don't. By the time you reach the fourth step, something important has already happened. You've learned how to recognize the internal triggers pulling at your attention. You've carved out real time for the things that matter, traction. You've reduced the obvious distractions in your environment, the external triggers. Now comes the final layer, the last line of defense: pacts. A pact is what psychologists call a pre-commitment device. It's a decision you make in advance about how you'll behave when the moment of temptation arrives. Because when that moment shows up, late at night, when you're tired, bored, restless, your future self is often weaker than your current self. So a pact is simply your present self helping your future self stay on track. There are three main kinds: effort pacts, price pacts, and identity pacts. Start with the simplest, the effort pact. An effort pact adds a little friction between you and the thing that distracts you. Not a wall, just a small speed bump. Sometimes that tiny bit of friction is all it takes to interrupt the automatic habit. Here's a very real example. A few years ago, after more than 2 decades of marriage, my wife and I noticed something uncomfortable. Our nights were slipping away. We'd go to bed, but instead of talking or resting or being close with each other, I'd be lying there scrolling on my phone while she was tapping away on her iPad. Sound familiar?
Night after night, we were going to sleep later and later. Our sleep suffered, our connection suffered. And it wasn't happening because we made a conscious decision to ignore each other. It happened because the internet was right there. Endless, effortless. One click leads to another, and suddenly an hour disappears. So when I started researching distraction, I tried something simple. I went to a hardware store and bought a 10-outlet timer, the kind you plug into a wall socket. Then I plugged our internet router into it. Now, every night at 10 p.m., the internet in our house shuts off automatically. Just like that. Could I turn it back on? Of course. All I'd have to do is crawl under my desk, unplug the timer, reset it, and reconnect everything. But that requires effort, and that small amount of friction is often enough to stop the impulse. When 10 p.m. arrives, we both know what's happening. The internet is about to disappear. So we finish whatever we're doing, and then the night moves in a different direction. Sleep, conversation, connection. Some people hear that and laugh. You needed a timer to improve your relationship? But the truth is, yes, because distraction rarely feels dramatic in the moment. It's subtle. You're waiting while your partner brushes your teeth, so you open your phone for a second. Then another link appears, then another notification, then another article. And suddenly it's midnight. That's how distraction works. It sneaks in quietly and steals time you meant to spend somewhere else, which is why these packs matter. They create a moment of mindfulness, a tiny pause where you ask yourself, do I actually want to keep doing this, or do I want to do what I said I would do?
It's the same reason something else belongs in your calendar that most adults strangely ignore: a bedtime. Think about it. Parents insist their kids need a bedtime. They're strict about it. But adults, we pretend we're somehow above that rule. Meanwhile, we read endless books about sleep optimization, blackout curtains, melatonin, nootropics, and yet the simplest solution gets ignored. Just go to bed on time. The real reason many people don't get enough sleep isn't complicated. They stay online too long. The internet never closes. That's the price of modern progress. You can access anything, anytime, day or night. Which means if you don't create boundaries, nothing will stop you. And that's exactly what packs are for. They're not perfect barriers. You could still bypass them if you really wanted to. But that's not the point. The point is friction. That small bit of effort forces you to pause. And sometimes that pause is all it takes to remember what you actually meant to do. What really matters about that 10 p.m. shutdown isn't just the technology. It's the signal. When that timer cuts the internet, it sends a message, not just to you, but to everyone around you. The day is over. Screens are done. Now it's time to wind down. And something interesting happens once that signal repeats night after night. People stop fighting it. They adapt. Eventually, you don't even need the timer anymore because the habit becomes part of the rhythm of the household. Everyone already knows what's coming. 10 o'clock arrives and the evening begins to close naturally. That's the deeper point. The timer itself isn't the magic. The commitment is. It's a visible boundary, a statement about how your time is going to work. And that idea matters far more than the specific tactic. Because tactics are just tools. One person might shut off the internet, another might lock their phone in a drawer. Someone else might use an app that blocks websites. Those are tactics, but underneath them sits something more important: the strategy. Strategy is understanding why these tools work in the first place. A lot of advice about productivity focuses on life hacks, tiny tricks you can copy and paste into your life. But life hacks alone rarely last. What matters is understanding the psychology behind distraction. Once you understand that, you can design your own solutions. The timer example is just one way to illustrate the principle. It shows how a small amount of friction, one extra step between you and the distraction, can shift behavior in a powerful way. And remember, that's only one type of pact. There are two others. First are price packs. A price pact adds a cost to distraction. If you break the commitment, you pay a price. That price might be financial, it might be social, it might be something simple like donating money to a cause you dislike if you fail to stick to your goal. The point isn't punishment. The point is accountability. Humans are very sensitive to loss. When there's something real on the line, our motivation changes. Then there are identity packs.
This is where the commitment becomes part of who you believe you are. Instead of saying, I'm trying to focus more, you say, I'm the kind of person who doesn't let distractions control my time. That subtle shift matters because when a behavior becomes tied to identity, breaking it doesn't just feel like a mistake. It feels like violating who you are. And people will go to incredible lengths to stay consistent with their identity. So the fourth step, preventing distraction with PACS, is really about reinforcing the system you've already built. Internal triggers, time for traction, managing external triggers. Those steps get you most of the way there. The PACS simply stand guard at the door, making sure distraction has one more barrier to cross before it gets in.
There's always been this lingering debate around willpower. People talk about discipline like it's the hidden ingredient behind everything. You hear it all the time. There are endless productivity systems, endless diet strategies, endless routines, time blocking, the 1-2-3 method, the ABC5 system. New frameworks appear every year. But underneath all of them sits the same question. If discipline isn't there, do any of these systems actually work? And that question leads to another idea that's been circulating for years, the belief that willpower is like a battery, a limited resource. The theory goes like this. Every time you use self-control during the day, your willpower drains a little. Eventually, you run out, and when the battery's empty, discipline disappears. That idea became known as ego depletion. The image was simple. Your willpower works just like your phone's battery. Use it too much, and eventually it dies. For a while, the concept spread everywhere. It showed up in psychology papers, business books, even mainstream media. Some studies made bold claims, like suggesting that drinking a sugary lemonade could literally replenish your willpower. It sounded convincing. But science has a habit of revisiting its own conclusions. When something feels a little too neat, researchers start testing it again. One of the people who did exactly that was Carol Dweck, known for her work on mindset. She decided to replicate those ego depletion experiments, run them again, see if the same results appeared. What she discovered was something fascinating. The only people who actually showed signs of running out of willpower were the people who believed willpower was limited. That was it. The people who believed willpower worked like a battery behaved exactly that way. They acted as if their mental energy was draining. But people who believed willpower wasn't limited, they didn't show the same depletion. In other words, the belief itself changed the outcome. That insight carries huge implications because it means the story we tell ourselves about our own limitations shapes how we behave. If you believe your brain is fragile, you'll treat it that way. If you believe the world is constantly hijacking your attention, you'll start acting as if you're powerless against it. Those beliefs quietly guide your actions. And that's why the myth of limited willpower can be so damaging. The moment you tell yourself, I've already used up my discipline today, you give yourself permission to give up. But when that belief disappears, something else becomes possible. Instead of assuming your willpower has been drained, you realize something simpler. You're still capable of choosing. And that small shift in belief can completely change how you approach discipline, focus, and the habits you're trying to build. Discipline is one of those words everyone uses, but almost nobody defines it clearly. People say things like, just be more disciplined, have more willpower, stick to the plan. But if you really stop and look at your own life, something strange appears. There are areas where discipline feels almost effortless. Maybe you go to the gym 6 days a week. Maybe you record your podcast consistently. Maybe you practice a hobby, like DJing, for hours without being forced. You show up, over and over again. No drama. But then there are other areas where discipline feels like a constant uphill battle. You fall off, start again, fall off again. So what's the difference? It's tempting to say the answer is motivation or passion, and part of that is true. If something is enjoyable, discipline becomes easier. But that explanation doesn't help when the task isn't enjoyable. And that's where the real problem begins.
Because flow, the famous state where time disappears and everything feels effortless, usually shows up in activities people already love: sports, music, creative hobbies. But life isn't only made of those moments. The real challenge isn't doing what you enjoy. The real challenge is doing what you don't feel like doing. That's where discipline actually matters. And interestingly, if you look at why people fail at their goals, the explanation is usually far simpler than we expect. It's not a complicated psychological breakdown. It's usually just a feeling. I don't feel like it. I don't feel like going to the gym today. I don't feel like writing that chapter. I don't feel like doing the difficult part of the project. So we stop. And that's why the earlier steps, understanding internal triggers and structuring time intentionally, become so important. Because feelings change. Passion fades when pressure rises. Take something like DJing. At the beginning, it's pure enjoyment, low stakes. You're doing it because it's fun. You enter flow easily. But then something changes. Suddenly, there's an audience. There's a show. 3,000 people are coming. Now there's pressure. Now the same activity that once felt effortless begins to feel heavy.
So what do you do when that happens? You return to something deeper than motivation. You return to values. Values are simply the attributes of the person you want to become. Not goals, not outcomes, just the kind of person you want to be. And from those values, you build something practical, a time-boxed calendar. Instead of starting with work tasks, you start with 3 domains of life. First, you. If you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anyone else. So you schedule time for rest, for exercise, for reading, even for leisure. Yes, video games, hobbies, whatever matters to you. If it matters, it goes on the calendar. Second, relationships. One reason loneliness has exploded in modern society is that we no longer schedule time for relationships the way earlier generations did. In the past, people gathered regularly through churches, community events, social rituals. Many of those structures disappeared. Now relationships often get whatever scraps of time remain. But if relationships matter, they must be scheduled intentionally. Time for friends, family, your partner, your kids. Put it in the calendar first. Then comes the third domain, work. And even within work, there are 2 kinds of effort: reactive work and reflective work. Reactive work is what most people spend their day doing: responding to messages, answering emails, reacting to requests, attending meetings. There's nothing wrong with that. But if your entire schedule's reactive, something dangerous happens. You move quickly in the wrong direction. That's why reflective work must be scheduled too. Time to think, time to create, time to work deeply on the projects that actually matter. Even if it's only 15 or 20 minutes, it needs to exist. Because without it, your day becomes an endless stream of reactions. Now, when you look at something like DJing or any passion project, the question isn't about outcomes. Not, will I become successful? The question is simpler. How much time and attention does the person you want to become invest in this activity? Because most people plan life around outputs. They write giant to-do lists filled with tasks. But to-do lists have a fatal flaw. They have no constraints. You can add tasks forever. And when the day ends and half the list remains unfinished, your brain quietly absorbs a message. I didn't do what I said I would do. Day after day, that reinforces a damaging self-image. But a time box calendar works differently. It has limits. 24 hours, no more. You can always make more money. You cannot make more time. Which is why time must be treated as the most valuable resource you have. Most people are careful with money and careless with time. It should be the opposite. Because when you build your life around time and attention, the real inputs, something changes. Instead of obsessing over the result, you focus on the ingredients. Just like a baker making cupcakes. The baker doesn't start with the finished cupcake, they start with flour, sugar, butter. Those ingredients produce the outcome. In knowledge work, the ingredients are the same every time: time and attention. If you don't allocate those deliberately, the result you want will never appear.